Traditional models of political economy struggle to predict the durability of Chinese authoritarian capitalism because they rely on a specific assumption about how promises are made. This is the standard game theory decision tree for credible commitment. It asks how a state proves it won't expropriate private wealth. Capitalists choose to invest or withhold, and the ruler chooses to protect or confiscate. This model treats the constituency as a given. The investor, their assets, and the ruler's temptations are defined before the problem is posed. Credibility is equated with rigid institutional constraint. A promise is only believable if an invariant rule is locked in after the investment is sunk. China presents a case where the constituency, the assets, and the policy menu weren't defined before the bargain began. Over 4 decades, the Chinese Communist Party authorized private accumulation, constructed markets, and incorporated entrepreneurs into the political order. The state engineered the capitalist class, whose expectations it would later have to manage. Successful reassurance created firms that did not exist and induced actors to acquire capacities they previously lacked. The party's commitment problem was created by the performance of its own promises. Conventional theory begins after the relevant constituency exists. It misses the mechanics of how a state manages wealth it actively helped produce. This political inclusion was an explicit doctrinal shift. Under Jiang Zemin's 3 represents, the party recast entrepreneurs as contributors to advanced productive forces, allowing them to join the party without forming an autonomous political opposition. These signals induced massive private participation. Policy shifted from isolated experiments to the creation of a private sector, now central to national employment and innovation. This scale introduced new systemic complexities. A large private sector implicates credit allocation, data governance, and offshore ownership structures that were non-existent when the reforms began. Private actors also changed. Large firms built sophisticated organizational capacities and legal hedges, allowing them to adapt their behavior in anticipation of future state intervention. Protecting a small, nascent market is a simple problem of tolerance. Governing a highly adapted financial network is a problem of national security. As private accumulation grows, the state's incentive to supervise or intervene grows with it. The state's temptation to regulate is an endogenous result of its earlier successful promises. When policy transforms society, it changes the strategic environment. Yesterday's fixed pledge becomes a new pledge addressed to a constituency that yesterday's policy helped create. In 1976, Robert Lucas argued that policy evaluation is invalid if it treats behavioral relationships as fixed when the policy rule changes. Optimizing agents revise their behavior in response to the rule. Applying this to politics reveals a recursive loop. Expected policy, private decisions, state transitions, and new policies are mutually responsive. Firms invest based on expected policy. These choices accumulate into new stocks, capital, and capacity, which force the government to update its posture. The state's next policy choice depends directly on these inherited variables. The rules it chooses are conditioned on the state that prior rules helped produce. This recursion is defined by strategic anticipation. Private actors value current choices, partly because they anticipate how the government will respond to the resulting economic state. While traditional models can repeat a static stage game indefinitely, a recursive transition changes the player's actual capacities in every round. Evaluating an authoritarian regime's credibility without accounting for the induced behavioral adaptations of its citizens repeats the analytical error Lucas identified 50 years ago. This dynamic leads to Proposition 1, the success-induced temptation. Successful reassurance raises the productive stock, which in turn raises the state's marginal payoff from revising the rules to manage that stock. The trajectory of Ant Group illustrates this mechanical response to successful accumulation. Initially, state reassurance allowed the platform to expand massively into lending and payments. It became a primary private allocator of domestic wealth. This accumulation shifted the state's risk profile. The platform's systemic role became a variable of national consequence, making state intervention more attractive than before. The regulatory crackdown in 2020 responded to a newly created state variable. Prior market development had created a new object of policy that required a different instrument. Such interventions immediately alter expectations. Market participants reorganize their legal and financial hedging based on how they expect the government to classify future risk. This loop provides a boundary. If the state destroys investment confidence, the deteriorating economy raises the value of renewed reassurance to repair the productive base. The system manages its own success by cycling between regulatory intervention and renewed reassurance. Western analysts often interpret the pairing of absolute support and strict control in China as bureaucratic noise or simple propaganda. Marxist dialectical language, focusing on dynamic balance and contradictions, functions analytically as a public transition law. An audited corpus of Chinese documents tested this. In texts concerning the private economy's creation, 90% of lexical hits are declarative reassurance. Conversely, in texts governing financial wealth conversion, 90% are obligatory revisability. Stable developmental ends are separated from adjustable policy instruments. The party defines specific boundaries for its commitment, separating the long-term role of the private economy from the permanence of any single regulatory role. In instrument commitment, a specific rule or policy choice is preserved across states. This is the traditional model of institutional immobility. China follows relational commitment. The goal is to preserve a valued political-economic relationship while allowing instruments to change as that relationship produces new tensions. The text data maps to the recursive loop. Reassurance activates the private economy, while revisability announces the state's response to the capital and adaptive capacity produced by that activity. Chinese dialectical theory treats productive advancement as an engine that continuously generates internal contradictions requiring new governance. Capitalists in China respond to this by combining productive participation with adaptive hedging. They act on the belief that the underlying relationship is secure, even while operational rules remain subject to calibration. This reaction function is coordinated from the highest levels of the party. It is a public architecture of commitment, not an arbitrary shift in preference. In a recursive political economy, stability is achieved by managing the contradictions inherent in development. Political science often assumes that authoritarian durability requires the elimination of policy revision through self-binding institutions. Credibility is rooted in mutual dependence. Relying on private accumulation makes total destruction of the relationship too costly, limiting the scope of state intervention. A successful commitment generates the conditions for its own revision, and regulatory responses generate the need for renewed reassurance. Political order acts as a process that generates the very players and the very problems the state must eventually govern. The Chinese party state has not solved the commitment problem by remaining static. It has maintained its position by making movement itself the core of the commitment.